In this lecture, we'll be discussing the concept of histology. Histology is the study of tissues, and in order to fully understand the idea of tissues, we need to go back and revisit the idea of hierarchical levels of organization. Hierarchical levels of organization are very important in understanding many of the concepts of anatomy and physiology. They involve structures coming together at one level of organization to form structures at the next level of organization. For instance, if we look at this diagram here showing the various levels of organization, we can see that we start out at the chemical level with atoms, and then atoms, based on their structure, will combine to form certain molecules. And those molecules also have a certain structure. The basic structure of the different molecules will determine how those molecules come together to form first organelles and then cells. So we move up through the level of organelles and then to the level of the cells. The level of the cells is a very basic level of organization, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about different types of cells and the structure of those cells. Cells, in turn, come together to form tissues. Tissues are defined as aggregates of the same type of cell that perform a specific function. And so this is the level that we'll be discussing in this lecture. The study of histology is the study of tissues. And so we'll be talking about the tissue level of organization. Tissues, in turn, come together to form organs. Organs are basically aggregates of different types of tissue. So we've got specific types of cells, for instance, in this case, a muscle cell or a smooth muscle cell. And then those smooth muscle cells will come together to form smooth muscle tissue. And we'll talk about the different types of tissue a little bit more in a minute. And then organs are basically aggregates of different tissues. Typically, most organs will have all the different types of tissues, and we'll discuss what those different tissues are in a second. So organs like your heart or your blood vessels will have connective tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, all the different types of tissue. So of the trillion or so cells that make up your body, of somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 different types, we can classify all of these different types of cells into four basic categories. And these are your four basic tissue types. You have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And these different types of tissues have basic functional properties. We'll see eventually that those functional properties come from the structure of the cells, which form the tissues and produce the structure of the tissue itself. Generally, epithelial tissue tends to form coverings. It acts as an interface tissue. It covers surfaces both within and outside of your body. It often forms glandular tissues that are involved in secretion. Connective tissue is typically involved in binding and support, and eventually we'll see that that has to do with the various connective tissue fibers that are found in connective tissue. There are other typically more specialized functions that connective tissues provide. And again, these more specialized functions are often connected to the structure of the tissue itself. For instance, blood is a connective tissue that's also specialized for transport of substances. Adipose is a type of connective tissue that helps with insulation and providing a storage reservoir for energy. Muscle tissue is all about creating movement, both within the body. Some of your organs will move based on muscle tissue, smooth or cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle is a type of muscle which allows you to move the various parts of your body that are under conscious control. And finally, we have nervous tissue, which is all about coordination and control of body functions. So the various cells that come together to form the different tissues give those different tissues specific special characteristics that allow them to form their various functions. As we mentioned, epithelial tissue is very much an interface tissue. It lines and covers parts of the body, forming protective coverings or membranes that allow for transport of substances. In the case of glands, the epithelial tissue secretes substances. And again, this is all based on the nature of the cells and how they come together. So epithelial tissues tend to have functions like protection, secretion, absorption, filtration, things like that. A lot of the various specific functions of the different tissues arise because of the organization of the cells. How are those cells organized? Are they very tightly packed? Are they close together? Are they far apart? Do they produce fibers? Things like this. In the case of epithelial tissues, the cells are packed very, very closely together. In fact, there's no space in between the cells, and as a result, the epithelial tissue tends to form layers that can act as boundaries. The tightly packing of the cells is a result of the various types of connections between those cells. Things like tight junctions and desmosomes connect the cells very, very closely with one another, and as a result, there are no spaces in between the cells. Since epithelial tissues cover things, epithelial tissues tend to have an inherent polarity. They have a surface that is typically attached to something, and they have a surface that is open, either to the outside of the body or to the opening of a cavity or the inside of a tubule within the body. We call the surface of the tissue that's attached to something the basal layer. Basal often means deep or refers to being deep. So in this case, you have this layer of cells here. This would be the basal layer. And in most cases with epithelial tissues, there's usually a very thin basement membrane that separates the epithelial tissue from the underlying tissue, and that's usually connective tissue. The other surface, the surface that's unattached or free, is often referred to as the apical surface. Apical often refers to being high or above or on top, apex, for instance. So you've got the basal surface underneath and the apical surface on top. And most of your epithelial tissues are organized in such a way that they'll have a very distinct basal surface that's attached to something and a very distinct apical surface that's open to some area. Epithelial tissues often have what's called an indirect blood supply. What that means is blood vessels are not typically found within the tissue itself, but they're often very, very close to the tissue. And what that does is it allows the tissue to be fed via diffusion. And as a result, since they have an indirect but ready supply of nourishment and oxygen, epithelial tissues are often highly regenerative. They can often support a high degree of cellular metabolism and a high degree of cellular division if that's what needs to happen. There are a number of different types of epithelial tissues, but before we get into the different types, it helps to understand how the different epithelial tissues are classified. Epithelial tissues typically have two names. The first name typically refers to the number of cell layers that make up that tissue. We typically refer to epithelial tissues as either simple or stratified. Simple epithelial tissues are composed of just a single layer of cells, whereas stratified epithelial tissues contain two or more layers. This diagram shows you the difference. Here we have a single layer of cells. This would be a simple epithelial tissue, and then below here we have a type of epithelial tissue that's composed of multiple cell layers, and that would be a stratified type of epithelial tissue. The second name of epithelial tissues refers to the shape of the cells, and there's three basic shapes. If the cell is flat, like floor tiles, we refer to it as squamous. If the cell is more or less cube-shaped, what that means is basically the same width as height. It may not be exactly cube-shaped, it may be more round, but if it's approximately the same width as height, we refer to it as cuboidal. And then finally, if the cells are tall and skinny, like columns, we refer to them as columnar. So we can put the different names together to form tissues like simple squamous or stratified squamous or stratified cuboidal. And we're going to look at the various specific types of tissues right now. The first specific epithelial tissue we're going to look at is simple squamous epithelium. Up to this point, you may have already figured out that the shape of the cell and the number of layers are very, very closely tied to the function. Whether or not that layer is thin, whether or not that layer is thick, whether there are a lot of cells in it, it's going to be very, very closely tied to the specific function of that tissue. For instance, If we look at simple squamous epithelium, we can see that it is a single layer of very, very, very flattened cells. As a result, it's very, very thin. You wouldn't expect a tissue like this to be very protective. It's very delicate. However, if the function that you're looking for is passage of substances or movement of substances across the membrane, it would be very functional for this. For instance, you've only got one layer of cells to deal with, and those cells are very, very flat. So what you have is a very small distance that substances have to travel in order to get past the membrane. So in a lot of cases, simple squamous epithelial tissue is involved with particularly passive movement of molecules or atoms across the membrane. Some places in the body that are found are in the lungs. For instance, this micrograph that you're seeing here are some of the air sacs within the lungs, and oxygen and carbon dioxide have to diffuse across this layer very readily. And so simple squamous epithelium makes a very functional tissue to use for this process. Simple cuboidal epithelium, as the name implies, is a single layer of cube-shaped cells. So this layer is going to be a little thicker than simple squamous epithelium, but still relatively thin. Simple cuboidal epithelium is often associated with linings of tubules, for instance, the kidney tubules that are all about passage of substances into and out of the urine, and the filtrate are lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. In some cases, they're also associated with glands. Simple cuboidal epithelium forms the ducts of a lot of glands, for instance, some of the various salivary glands, as well as some of the glands in the pancreas and other areas of the body. So simple cuboidal epithelium is more associated with secretion and, to a lesser extent, absorption of substances within the body. And what you're seeing here is a micrograph showing you the kidney tubules and how you can see that the walls of the tubules are made up of this simple cuboidal epithelium. Next we have simple columnar epithelium. Once again, a single layer of cells, but now the cells are much taller. They're column-shaped. This, once again, increases the thickness of the layer. And again, simple columnar epithelium is often associated with secretive or absorptive functions. Simple columnar epithelium lines a lot of the organs within your body, for instance, the organs of the digestive tract, small intestine, stomach have a lining of simple columnar epithelium. In the digestive system, simple columnar epithelium secretes a lot of your digestive fluids, and it helps to absorb nutrients. Again, the small intestine is all about absorption of substances. Sometimes, when absorption is one of the main functions of a tissue, the cells have extra structures that make the tissue even more specialized for absorption. In this case, you can see the basement membrane and the basal layer, and then you can see the apical layer that is open to the inside of the small intestines. And in a lot of cases, cells will have characteristics which help to increase their surface area. Absorption is going to be very closely tied to surface area. The more surface area you have, the more cells can absorb at any given point in time. So sometimes cells will have small cytoplasmic extensions of their plasma membrane called microvilli, which project upwards from the apical surface that increase the surface area. They often look like little finger-like projections of the cell membrane up into the open area. And again, what that's going to do is it's going to increase the surface area and further increase the amount of absorptive capabilities. In some cases, there are other cells associated with simple columnar epithelial linings and other columnar epithelial linings. A common form of cell that's associated with simple columnar epithelial linings are goblet cells. Goblet cells are individual cells that secrete mucus onto the apical surface, and that mucus is functional. For instance, we'll see when we look at the next tissue that in your respiratory systems, mucus helps to trap particles that make it into your respiratory system before they get down into your lungs. The last of the four major simple epithelial tissues we're going to look at is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified has a name that is not exactly like the others. It's not simple columnar, simple squamous, but the name is very descriptive. It is technically a simple tissue because it is composed of a single layer of cells. Those cells, however, are not all exactly the same. For instance, if we look back at the tissues that we've looked at so far, the cells are all the same. They're all either squamous or cuboidal or columnar. With pseudostratified epithelium, the cells are not exactly the same. All of the cells originate at the basement membrane. In other words, they all touch the basal surface. They all come into contact with the basement membrane. Some of those cells are tall enough that they will actually project upwards and reach the free surface. So you can see that this cell here is tall enough that it reaches the free surface. Some of the cells, however, are smaller and shorter, and they do not project all the way up to the free surface. As a result, the nuclei of these cells are at different levels. Some of them are higher up, some of them are lower down. And this tends to give the impression that the tissue has multiple layers, because you've got some nuclei that are lower, some nuclei that are higher up. Further contributing to this is the presence of goblet cells. You have goblet cells in there that are a different shape. And as a result, the tissue has an appearance of being multi-layered. That, however, is not the case, because all of the cells start at the basement layer. It's just that some of them project up to the top and some of them don't. Pseudostratified epithelium is very commonly found in your larger respiratory passages, for instance, your trachea, the larger bronchioles. And pseudostratified epithelium, in addition to having those goblet cells that secrete mucus onto the free surface, have further specializations. They have these cilia that project up from the free surface of the cells, and those cilia will beat rhythmically to help move the mucus up and out of the respiratory passages. So what you have is the goblet cells secreting the mucus, which will then trap your larger particles that you inhale along with the air that you breathe. And the cilia will beat rhythmically and allow you to move that mucus up and out of the respiratory passages. Now let's look at the major stratified epithelial tissues. And as we saw with the simple epithelial tissues, there are four major stratified epithelial tissues. The first one we're going to look at is stratified squamous epithelium. So once again, as the name implies, multiple layers of flattened cells. Stratified squamous epithelium is named primarily for the upper layers of cells. As you can see here, the cells in the upper layers of this tissue are very, very, very flat. If we go down into the lower layers, however, the cells look more cuboidal. The reason for this is very often those are the generative cells, the cells that are dividing to produce the cells that are going to populate the tissue. As more and more cells are produced, the cells are pushed further and further up, and as they go further and further up, they tend to flatten out. And that's what produces the flat cells that this tissue is named for. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this tissue. Stratified squamous epithelium is the most widespread of the stratified epithelia. It is found in areas that deal with a lot of abrasion or need a lot of protection. The outer surface of your skin is basically stratified squamous epithelium. Those cells are infused with a protein called keratin, and we'll talk about that more when we do the skin lecture. But that keratin gives those cells a very tough consistency. And combined with the multiple layers of those cells, you get a very protective and even in a lot of cases waterproof boundary. Stratified squamous epithelium tends to line or cover areas that are open to the outside of the body because those are areas that tend to get a lot of abrasion. You have non-keratinized forms that line the insides of your digestive tract that are open to the outside, for instance, esophagus, mouth, things like that. The lining of the anus is also stratified squamous epithelium. The next epithelium we're going to talk about is transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium, as the name implies, has the ability to change its shape. Transitional epithelium is most commonly associated with the linings of the urinary system, particularly the bladder and the ureters. These are structures that have to stretch as urine is produced, particularly in the bladder. As urine builds up in the bladder is going to stretch, and as a result, the inside lining of that organ has to stretch along with it. Transitional epithelium has the ability to change its shape as the bladder stretches. What we're looking at here are two images of transitional epithelium where it is relaxed. And you can see the basic shape of the cells. They're not arranged very meticulously like the other stratified layers. It almost looks like they're kind of haphazardly arranged. But what you have are multiple layers of cells that line the inside of the bladder. As the bladder stretches, the transitional epithelial layer is going to stretch, and as a result, those cells are going to tend to flatten out. And as they flatten out, they're going to be able to cover more area. So the appearance of this tissue is going to change based on whether the bladder is relaxed, like you're seeing in this picture, or whether it is stretched. When the bladder is stretched, the tissue is going to appear much thinner, and the cells are going to appear much more flat. The transitional epithelium lining the inside of the bladder and the ureters provides, as we mentioned, an expandable lining that helps to prevent infection, providing a barrier between the inside of those urinary passages, and it also helps to prevent substances from urine from diffusing back into the body once the urine has been created. The last two stratified epithelia are a lot less common. You have stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, and these are not nearly as widespread as the other two. Stratified cuboidal epithelium tends to be just a few layers thick, 2 to 3 layers of cuboidal cells, and is largely found in a lot of ducts of different glands. For instance, salivary glands, within the mammary glands, and the pancreas. Sometimes the walls of the ducts are thicker and are made up of multiple layers of cuboidal cells. And that's where we typically find stratified cuboidal epithelium. Stratified columnar epithelium, again, is relatively uncommon, and typically what you have is a couple layers of columnar cells. In some cases, it's only the outer layer of cells that are columnar, and the inner layers are more cuboidal. And again, this type of tissue is found in relatively limited regions within the body. It's found within the male urethra, within the vas deferens, and a few other parts in the body. So these are the major epithelial tissues that we see in the body.